It's my pleasure today to introduce my friend as our first speaker is Ray Demarchi. And I'm going to read this. Get my glasses going here. Ray was born and raised in Kamloops, where he and his two brothers developed an early appreciation of nature and wildlife from their dad, who often took them hunting and fishing. This heritage gained from their father resulted in all three sons and 6 grandchildren pursuing university educations, with 5 of them becoming wildlife biologists. Time spent on his relatives' ferry, farm, poultry farms, and cattle farms, plus a couple of weeks in Vancouver each summer, provided Ray with a wide range of experiences growing up. A summer job at Kamloops Range Research Station in 1961 provided experience in range management and research. He then completed a master's degree in the ecology of California bighorn sheep prior to joining the BC Fish and Game Branch at the Kootenay Region Wildlife Biologist, as the Kootenay Region Wildlife Biologist in 1964, and I remember that. Ray spent 28 years as Kootenay Regional Wildlife Biologist, managing the region's rich wildlife resources, which he will tell you more about in the talk this morning. Ray was a strong supporter of the BC Wildlife Federation and the Kootenay Wildlife Heritage Fund, and actually, along with the late Joel Hall and myself, came up with an idea for the Provincial Habitat Conservation Trust Fund. It was called the Habitat Conservation Fund. He also helped to initiate the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. One little known fact is that he is a friend from Kamloops, Norman Hull, founded the Cranbrook Girls and Boys Club. He was transferred to the Habitat Protection Branch in Victoria in 1992 and was given the assignment of coordinating the provincial government's initiative to double the province's parks and protected areas. He says that ensuring hunting and guide outfitting were permitted in all large provincial protected areas was one of his major contributions to the process. While continuing as a protected area specialist, he took on the job of Chief of Wildlife Conservation and retired in 1997 after initiating the Identified Wildlife Program, producing the province's grizzly bear conservation strategy, and revising the province's hunting regulation standards and procedures. Over the years, Ray's career was enriched by a number of international wildlife studies in several third world countries, namely Venezuela, Guyana, Kenya, as well as personal wildlife excursions throughout Canada, Northern Europe, Mexico, Costa Rica, and the US, visiting numerous national parks and national wildlife refuge. From 1997 to 2000, the author and his wife, Carol Hartwig, formed a wildlife consulting firm, completing thin-horn and bighorn sheep status reports, wildlife habitat inventories, assessments, and plans for both government and private organizations. Following their retirement in 2007, they participated in coastal waterbird surveys as citizens, volunteers, and several initiatives dealing with water quality and flows into Cowichan watershed. They currently make their home on the south shore of the wildlife-rich Cowichan estuary, while maintaining a connection with friends, family, and wildlife issues here in the Kootenays. Actually, Ray not only could you hunt in the park, he's the first guy that I know of that could build a house in the park. He's got a cabin at Fort Steele, and his son here, who's, of course, a pharmacist. Before he comes, and he's coming right now, I just got this Foundation for Wildlife out of Idaho. 1995, 12 wolves introduced. 2005, 520 wolves present. 2011, 800 wolves present. 1995, 16,000 elk. 2016, 1,000 elk. Ray.
I'd like to tell everybody I broke my ankle falling off my horse, but I actually broke it trying to clear my driveway 2 months ago. Fell on my ankle. Another story. It's a real honor to be here. I'm a little choked. Coming back. got both family and lifelong friends. And maybe a few, I won't call them enemies, opponents. I always felt that old saying that it's not your friends who make you strong, it's your enemies. And tried to always be philosophical about any opposition and take people's points of views into account. But I really do mean that it's an honor to be here. So, where do you want to go, and how do we get there? But first, we don't know where we're going if we don't know where we've been or where we are now. So the first question I asked myself when I started to write this, what do you, the majority of the attendees, expect to hear from a biologist who was practicing game management when your dads were the same age or even younger than you are now, although there's a lot more older people in here than I ever figured, but there it is. My best before date is long past due, and I haven't practiced the art and science of big game management for 27 years, nearly as long as my 28-year tenure as regional biologist here in the Kootenays. I can't pack 33 years of history with the wildlife branch into a 45-minute talk, but I'll try to give you a glimpse of where we were, where we are now, and where we might go. And I'll also offer some suggestions of how we might get there. You will also hear today from others who have a lot to offer in the way of advice, and as to where we need to put our efforts to get us out of the dilemma of declining ungulate populations we find ourselves in at the moment. What I was handed in the fall of 1964 when I first started working here was the most spectacular big game resource in Canada. It was referred to then as the Serengeti of North America, and it compared right up there with the best in the western US. Only Montana has the same number of big game species as the Kootenay region. That first winter of 1964-65, I counted and classified nearly 9,000 head of big game, which included 6 species of ungulates, plus numerous coyotes and several cougars. There were no wolves, and of course I didn't see any black or grizzly bears because it was winter and they were hibernating. You know, as big game managers go, I think I made at least a passing grade over the 28 years that I managed the game resources of the East Kootenay. And there was a lot more to the job than setting hunting regulations. But in a region that for years supported up to 25% of the big game hunting in the province, setting hunting seasons and bag limits was a big part of the job. Because I could only find little other than the basic fundamentals of big game management in books, it was a steep learning curve for me, having been given the job at the tender young age of 24 years. But then I got to work with men who just 20 years previously had gone to war around the same age I was then or even younger. And I'm talking about the 11 conservation officers that were here when I arrived on the scene. And it was an honor to work with them as well. They had their own ideas about how the game should be managed, and they weren't bashful in telling me about it. One of my first lessons was to pay attention to history, and that would probably be useful today. The history of game management in the East Kootenay is complex and only partially known. For one thing, we know very, very little about what the Indians really did, the Aboriginal people here in the valley, in terms of burning, game management, the way they had their own way of practicing game. I'm sure Wayne Choquette could add to that. Change is normal in nature, and big game populations are no exception. Big game populations fluctuate widely, and despite what some of you may believe, and I just said some of you, they don't always remain at high levels. It was Ken Semanek once that pointed me, amigo, he said, you know, things are always changing out there. They don't stay the same. And it was a good lesson. Early explorers reported scarcities of game and were often forced to eat their horses and their dogs. David Thompson spent one particularly miserable winter in 1808 and 1809, it's a little over 200 years ago now, on the Big Bend of the Columbia, where he and his men complained of being forced to eat spawned-out Chinook salmon. Yes, the salmon went all the way up the Columbia in those days before the big dams. And they finally resorted to eating their dogs. Here's a personal story for you. I got a connection with the Elk Valley. My mother was born in 1913 and raised in the Elk Valley in what was then the coal mining town of Michelle. She told me one winter when meat was so scarce that they killed and ate a horse. I was actually visiting the Elk Valley with my mom and dad and my two brothers at the time in 1956, and she was visiting some of her cousins and stuff like Gino Borsato and the Corines and so on. And I said, Mom, if you ate a horse, why didn't you just eat some wild game? And she said, because there wasn't any. It was funny that 8 years later, there I was doing a helicopter survey right above her house, what was left of it, and I counted 300 elk on the hill above their house that day. The historical record tells us that game numbers remained low throughout the 19th and early part of the 20th century, right up until at least 1935, 1940. You can read about this scarcity in the historic records in books by David Thompson, who I mentioned already, Bailey Groman's book, The 10 Years of Sport and Life in the Canadian Rockies, or W.T. Hornaday's Campfires in the Canadian Rockies, to name three of the most informative ones. There are other books as well, but they all tell the same story. There was very little big game because of the lack of suitable winter forage under the mature park-like pine, fir, and larch forests. We'll talk more about that in a minute. For the first half of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, in other words, big game management and enforcement was the responsibility of the district game warden, and it consisted of setting conservative males-only hunting seasons for ungulates and long liberal seasons for large carnivores. Bud Ellis, who's still alive here in Cranbrook, and I just saw him last fall, was the last surviving member of that original association, is now in his 90s, bridged the gap between the game warden as game cop and game manager, and then later saw the transition from the fish and game cops they became to environmental police that they are today. Some jurisdictions like Colorado still have multidisciplined fish and wildlife game wardens. But others, like Oregon, and we seem to have copied their model, and BC, have put all of the emphasis on law enforcement and, of course, attending to nuisance animal complaints. What caused the great number of ungulates to occur that the old-timers still reminisce about? In the 1920s and 1930s, the Canadian Pacific Railroad, the Canadian National Railroad were expanding their spur lines as the prairies were being converted into grain farms, and there was a great demand for ties. Until that time, early explorers such as John Palliser had written that the East Kootenay Trench was dominated by mature open park-like forests, where even firewood was scarce. There's one little episode that he wrote about camping near Canal Flats, where they spent a half an hour, all the men in the camp, and they had to travel as far as 400 meters away from their camp to get enough firewood to light a fire that night, because the repeated fires. These forests were dominated by fireproof fir, pine, and larch, which is a result of low-intensity wildfires which occurred throughout the trench as frequently as every 12 to 15 years. And here I think it is where it goes that it was indigenous people that did this burning. Tie logging occurred in both the trench and the major side valleys, and extensive areas were logged. And they put little railroads in to haul the logs out. But they didn't manage their slash. They just left it on the ground. And with the big trees gone and the slash on the ground, the landscape was set up for some major fires. And I'm talking major fires, not little fires. After this buildup of slash, the fires arrived in the 20s and the 30s, several of which covered 100,000 or 200,000 acres each. Famous winter ranges included Newgate, McDonald Burn, Wigwam Flats, the China Wall, Pickering Hills, Bull River, and Premier Ridge, plus numerous other burned areas which all produced forage for wintering ungulates developed. With access to both productive winter and summer ranges, mule deer and whitetail numbers literally exploded. During the war years of the early to mid-1940s, game numbers increased rapidly. These fires occurred in the 20s and the 30s. And then there was the war. There wasn't a lot going on. There wasn't a lot of hunting happening during the war period. Game numbers increased rapidly as a result of the newly created winter ranges and the very limited hunting activity. Late fall migrations of 1,000 mule deer in a day exiting the Bull River single file onto the Pickering Hills are still recounted by old-timers who recall competing as to who could count the most deer on their way to school by bus from the Bull River to Wardner in the 50s and 60s. Jimmy Logan, an old friend and colleague of mine, is one of those old-timers, born and raised in the Bull River. For centuries, extensive subalpine and alpine ranges in the Rocky and Purcell Mountains had benefited mountain goats and both species of bears. But both species of deer, whitetail and mule deer, and moose numbers had remained at low numbers until the extensive logging and wildfire created those extensive areas of productive cereal shrub grasslands in the trench, which provided much needed forage during critical winter months. Then in the 1950s, in the face of what we now know as a period of superabundance of wild ungulates, the management regime changed when the province hired its first university game biologists. And it was a tough transition at the time between the biologists and the old game wardens who were now taking off the job of managing wildlife. W.G. Glenn Smith was the first game biologist in the Kootenays, arriving here in 1954 and then moving to Victoria, chief of wildlife, in 1964. And we owe the man a lot. He put his job on the line more than once to save the Crown land that we now use as winter ranges and hunting areas and recreational areas and cross-country skiing and horseback riding and whatever. Because most of the valleys south of the Trans-Canada Highway in British Columbia were sold off. So we owe him that. With the arrival of biologists, the conservative males-only seasons that had been enforced since the beginning of the 20th century were suddenly replaced with liberal antlerless seasons. Oh my goodness. The next 10 to 12-year period saw the opening of antlerless seasons on all ungulate species except bighorn sheep and moose. Well, bighorn sheep ewes I'm talking about. Elk, which had only recently begun to expand their range and their numbers, became overhunted. See, the deer had built up, but the elk were just moving in and starting to build up, if you look at the history of the elk, which Bob Jameson, by the way, put together for us. Seasons were extended into December, and big harvests occurred. Mule deer likewise. Cow moose remained closed in the East Kootenay. They were opened up in the interior and in the north. Cow moose. But except for a 1 week season in 1968 and again in 1969. But they were generally thought to be too scarce to be continued to be hunted under a general open season. But of course, this was before the province developed limited entry system in 1971. And I'll point out again that, we were on the leading edge of a lot of this stuff. I was only biologist here from 1964 to 71. And then Bill Workington was hired as technician, 71. But Ken Semanek had the whole northern half of British Columbia, right? The whole northern half, one biologist, no technician, no assistant. And he put on the first limited entry hunting season in the province on the Nass goats. And that system is still in use today, the one that Kenny developed. All of these actions and events had the net effect of greatly increasing the number of hunters throughout the province, and particularly in the East Kootenay, which resulted in a series of record game harvests. Let me again point out that while there are several other species of meat-eating carnivores, 7 to be exact in the Kootenays, if you include the rare ones, like wolverines and fisher, plus a goodly number of ravens, which also speed up the carnivore predation process. There were no wolves to speak up in either the West or the East Kootenay, or hardly any, let's say. Despite the fact that the scarcity of ungulates in the 1800s and 1900s had kept wolf numbers extremely low to begin with, predator control was nonetheless relentless. Any wolf venturing into the region from those in the scattered packs in the 7 national parks adjacent to the East Kootenay and the unsettled Big Bend area were constantly under the gun, the trap, or poison under agency authorization. In addition to setting hunting season regulations, the Game Commission then set the policies for predator control. The district game wardens practiced intensive predator control through the use of bounties for trappers, plus agency-conducted poisoning, first with the use of strychnine and cyanide, and later with 1080 or sodium fluoracetate. The first trials with 1080 were carried out in the 1950s. You know, 1080 is more of a canid-specific poison. It was designed, it's called 1080 because it was the 1080th chemical tested by the American government to kill wolves. And it's canid specific. That's what the thing about it. Doesn't only kill canids, because they use it in New Zealand for other things like possums and so on. But strychnine and cyanide they're very general, and they killed a lot of peripheral animals that were not targeted. Not a good thing. The first trials with 1080 were carried out in the mid-1950s, and by the late 1950s, its use had become widespread throughout the province, particularly in the north. From conversations I had with the respective district game wardens, it was used in the East Kootenay and the West Kootenay as well, mainly to control coyotes, although some wolves were targeted at least once in the Duncan watershed, and I suspect also in the Flathead, although don't have the positive proof about that. I think it's worth recounting that before it was discovered that a mere 18 milligrams of 1080 would kill an adult wolf, it was used in much greater quantities in treating horse meat, which was dropped out of airplanes and occasionally helicopters in broadcast baiting. When I first got to Cranbrook in the fall of 1964, there was a 45-gallon drum of the stuff in the warehouse. All that identified that barrel of canid-specific poison was a small cardboard tag attached to a government-issued porcelain cup, written in pencil, 1080. At 18 milligrams per wolf, that 45-gallon drum contained enough poison to kill every wolf in BC and then some. It was shipped to Suffield in Alberta and destroyed along with a barrel of toxaphene, which is another story. Now let's reflect on the late 40s through the 50s and into the early 60s. Each species has its own story, from grizzly bears, which had been heavily exploited by commercial hunting over bait and no restrictions as to sex or age, plus mountain goats, which had been decimated by early hunting seasons set in late August, which caught them still on the low elevation mineral licks. You didn't need a lot of access into the mountains because the goats would come down to the licks and they got shot off. They really did. And Bill Workington, Dave Phelps, and Bob Jameson all can attest to that, because they were the first ones to examine the data that we had that showed they'd been really overhunted in the 1950s and early 60s. Significantly, reducing the male component leads to physically depleted males entering the winter in all ungulate species, and is often a result of excessive males-only seasons, often coupled with complete protection of females. It is a conservative way of managing wildlife and takes little creativity or effort, but apparently that kind of management has become the norm throughout the province as present. Despite the overharvesting that occurred during the 50s and 60s, compared to the immediate past, most big game populations remained at relatively high numbers, especially white-tailed deer, which have their own way of avoiding hunters, mainly by becoming nocturnal. But still, despite the abundance of big game populations that had developed after a century and a half of scarcity, many hunters, Most guide outfitters and virtually all of the game wardens perceived that hunting seasons were too generous and that the game harvests of the 50s and the 60s were not sustainable. And that's when I came in. Even during that period of record harvest, however, not all hunters were successful in filling their tags. One of my first jobs in the East Kootenay was working on the 2 roadside game checks, which operated at Cranbrook and Tata Creek, and exposed to the majority of hunters coming through with the same message that fall of 1964. Shut her down for 5 years. If I heard that once, I heard it at least 100 times. When one unsuccessful hunter who checked into the game check asked me, "Where's all the game at?" I answered by saying, "They're still way back in the high country." Another guy, overhearing the conversation, said, "Yeah, they're way back, all right, way back in 48. The fact that the major big game winter ranges were created by fire and were rapidly losing forage quality and quantity and growing back to coniferous forest was evident to those of us who had some range management training. My brother Dennis, who was the provincial wildlife habitat ecologist, determined that as early as 1971 that the cereal shrub ranges were being overtaken by coniferous regeneration at the rate of 5% per year, and that in 20 years, he predicted, most of them would be grown over. By the time 1992 rolled around and I was leaving the East Kootenay, his predictions had proven correct. Nearly all of the critical south-facing capability winter ranges and bighorn winter range, deer, elk, and bighorn winter range areas had succumbed to the relentless reinvasion of conifer trees, which had all but completely replaced the shrubs and grasses which had sustained those vast numbers of wild ungulates. After World War II, domestic cattle under permit began to replace the herds of feral horses that had been built up on the completely unfenced ranges during particularly World War II. Domestic cattle were competing with wildlife of all kinds, including elk, deer, bighorn sheep, and sharp-tailed grouse, which finally became extirpated. Most ranges permitted by government for cattle were overgrazed from the post-war years well into the 70s. In order to correct this, for a short time from 1975 to 1983, the livestock and big game winter ranges in the Trent were managed under a program called Coordinated Resource Management Planning. Over 500 miles of livestock control fences were built on some 20 range units to redistribute cattle. At the same time, the Wildlife Branch launched a supplemental winter feeding program, which Carmen mentioned, the early one that he mentioned that I was involved with. Range quality and productivity responded well to the improved grazing systems. Plus, we did some prescribed burning and logging, and this combined with the winter feeding program saw elk numbers rebound, much to the chagrin of some of the ranching community. Ignoring the improvements on range quality and productivity, a few ranchers that saw only the benefits to elk and deer and not to their livestock went to Victoria and raised hell. As a result of this negative political pressure, CRMP fell out of favor with the newly elected government and was abandoned. This was in spite of CRMP, coordinated planning, being successful in not only improving livestock grazing, but in coordinating logging and prescribed burning. Relations between wildlife and livestock interest reached a new low. At the time, I was told to either reduce the elk population or start thinking about a new career. Although there has been some attempt to improve forage conditions for both wildlife and livestock through the Rocky Mountain Trench Ecosystem Restoration Program, since the termination of CRMP, the amount of range improvement that has been done is woefully inadequate. Because a large proportion of the land in the East Kootenay Trench is publicly owned, this is not all bad news, because great opportunities remain to restore the productivity, at least of the best of the high capability winter ranges. In fact, hunters and wildlife agencies alike would be doing the province and the people who live in the trench a great favor by using logging and prescribed burning to restore critical winter habitats while creating fire breaks at the same time. Think about it. You get more than 2 bangs for your buck. In the spring of 2014, this is a personal thing, I visited the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. Brand new building, 3 stories, multi-million-dollar facility, well-staffed. Although I was aware of the effects of decadal oscillation and the El Niños and El Niñas on winters, and particularly on Dall sheep in the Yukon, as well aware of the detrimental impact of severe winters, I was still an agnostic when it came to man-caused global warming. I walked in a climate change skeptic, but after a personal tour by the director, I came out a convert. Whether or not you choose to accept this phenomenon as fact, it would be unwise not to take this opportunity to begin an intensive multi-pronged program of habitat improvement to begin the job of restoring wild ungulate populations. You know, climate change is it's the flavor of the month. In fact, it's the flavor of the frickin' century, it looks like. So why not capitalize on it? Everybody else is. During those years of high harvests, there was little consideration for the welfare of the animals themselves. And this is another thing where I come from on this. And what little anti-hunting sentiment there may have been back then amongst the general public, it had no real influence on the politics of wildlife management of the day. But that was about to change. For most people, there are events that occur in their lives that stick out amongst all others. One of those for me was meeting Tony Bubenik in 1975 and hearing his concept of hunters as maintainers of big game social and biological health in moose and elk populations. This concept of big game ungulates as social beings was not uppermost in most hunters and wildlife managers' minds, but more and more people are coming to realize that all animals possess their own version and their own requirements for a healthy social existence. Tony Bubenik described moose rutting behavior and defined it as serially monogamous. That is, a bull may breed several cows during a breeding season, but unlike a bull elk, tends to only one cow at a time. And it is the cow that chooses the bull she wishes to breed with, preferring older males to younger ones. Thus, one requirement of a socially healthy moose population is an adequate proportion of mature males to females. Each species has its own unique breeding behavior, and wildlife managers need to understand them in order to manage populations to their greatest advantage. You may not know it, but the province has set a minimum sex ratio of 35 bulls per 100 cows in our managed moose populations. Do you understand what that means? It means that when the sex ratio drops that low, very few bulls will ever reach full maturity, and that it is disruptive to the moose population, and it is the opposite of what I mean by social and biological well-being. And it leads to the depletion of breeding male condition during the critical winter season. So they enter the winter in tough shape. Val Geist, who will be speaking next, is another biologist who understands this concept, and I remember his disappointment when he came to the Ashnola in southern BC in the fall of 1964 to examine sheep behavior during the rut. The second of 2 years of significant overhunting of California bighorn rams, there was an open season on three-quarter curl rams, and there hadn't been a season since 1948, left only the younger cohorts in the population. Those younger, rambunctious rams in the presence of the normal component of mature alpha rams would have been feeding and getting ready for winter, that they should have been, were rutting themselves into early oblivion, harassing and mounting the ewes that were desperately trying to escape their sexual advances. Now, little philosophy. When I look at life, I often think of it in terms of contrasts. What are the good and the bad of doing something? But what are the good and bad of not doing the same thing? It's a 4x4 matrix that helps me to plan and solve problems. Is there anything simpler yet more complex than the economic equation of supply and demand? Or what about the basic equation of population growth, which is simply births minus deaths? Simple binary equations that are basic as night and day, hot and cold, right or wrong, or consumptive and non-consumptive. And that's where the majority of you today come in. So you are consumptive users as opposed to non-consumptive users. And as Kenny would point out. It's a simple fact of life that we're all, in some sense, consumptive users, whether or not we're hunters. And somehow, in some people's minds, that has been equated not with good, that you're a consumptive user, but with bad. And in non-hunters are basically good, but hunters are not. And hunting is bad. And people who hunt primarily for trophies are particularly bad. But then there are a lot of people in the middle who do not have their minds made up, don't share those views about hunters or hunting one way or the other, but will base their opinions on what they're exposed to in the media or in life. Those are the people we should be talking to and educating about our interests. We have to forget about trying to change the minds of the dedicated animal rightsists. You won't change their minds any more than you would have changed their ancestors' minds that burned witches. It goes without saying that British Columbia is a province of contrasts, urban versus rural being one major one. Or, as we used to joke, 75% of the population in British Columbia is beyond hope. I'm going to exclude the ones that live on Vancouver Island, where I am now. I grew up in the interior of BC, and except for the 5 winters I spent at university, I spent the first 52 years of my life in rural communities. In the last 26 years, however, I've lived on Vancouver Island, which has exposed me to a lot more, to urban reality, urban people, urban press, and urban attitudes. Sort of like the country cousin meets his city cousins, and you remember that from your childhood fables. A couple of things to ponder. The first is that wildlife is a common property resource. That is, it belongs to everyone in the province, of course, taking into account the established or aboriginal rights of Indigenous peoples to harvest wildlife for food, social, ceremonial purposes in their traditional areas and treaty rights. But I hope when it comes to this pursuit that common sense will prevail and we will accept the fact that we all, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, share this planet and all have responsibility for its well-being. The second thing is that it is important to note that human health and safety are a priority in any government organization, including the Conservation Officer Service. Think about that. Human health and safety being a priority for government. And it is. But what can a CO do to protect the public other than respond to dangerous or nuisance animal situations? They certainly can't decide on the species and number of animals that exist in a given area. And what of the wildlife managers? Do they think of their in terms of management activities benefiting wildlife and protecting the health and safety of the public? I wonder. Of all the wildlife conferences that I've attended or read about, the subject of hunters benefiting wildlife and the public is mostly absent. I think that the fact that managers and their superiors don't consider hunting as a way to benefit the well-being of the animals and the populations they manage is one of the reasons that hunting is exposed to the criticisms of anti-hunters and animal rights people who see no benefits to themselves or to society, for that matter, from big game management. Yet in spite of some great writers and advocates and the great tool we have in the internet, we're not always successful in promoting our interests. Why? I guess that is why you're here today, to listen to some old-time game managers who collectively have over 300 years of experience in wildlife management, research, and public relations. So going back to the basic life equations of births minus deaths, what can we do to perpetuate and perhaps enhance our interest in hunting? I'm a member of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation as well as a lifelong member of the BC Wildlife Federation. And I support both of them for what they've done for wildlife. And hunters. But both promote hunting. But the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation goes so far to claim on every cover of Bugle magazine, and I have one here somewhere, right here. At the bottom in the corner, it reads, "Hunting is conservation." Think about that for a minute. Hunting is conservation? No, I don't believe that on its own it is. Hunting is definitely a major tool of conservation, but it does not of itself in its raw form supplant the full meaning of the term conservation. Now coming to a common definition of conservation is a little difficult, but I found one on the internet which said that is defined as the prevention of wasteful use of a resource. Okay, kind of the negative way of looking at it, but I think that selective hunting could be construed to be conservation, however, if it is applied correctly. And by correctly, I mean in such a manner that the social and biological health of a population is maintained. Public attitudes toward hunting are an important consideration because I said earlier, wildlife are a common property resource, meaning that they belong to all of us, hunters and non-hunters and anti-hunters alike. We will never get the most extreme anti-hunters to change their position, but we can influence those in the middle, which have at times been referred to as the silent majority. Hitting them over the head with our sport is not an advisable method. One only need look at the approach which was originally taken by the proponents of oil sands development and their pipelines, and where their aggressive support got them. So I would refer you to a book I just read, Chris Turner's The Patch. Tells you more about what they shouldn't have done than what they should do. But what if hunters were able to demonstrate scientifically and convincingly that what they do actually benefits wildlife? What if their hunting activities also contribute to human health and safety at the same time? What if their activities and their spending benefited general wildlife? Of all the proceedings of the various wildlife symposiums and workshops and meetings I've attended, I only heard once from one speaker from Germany make a reference to hunters benefiting the socio-biological health of big game, and that was through the very intensive selective hunting and wildlife husbandry programs practiced in Germany. Once only. Other than, of course, Tony Bubenik, who spoke of the benefits of establishing and maintaining near normal sex ratios and age class structures of moose populations, and my good friend Val Geist, who you'll hear from next if I get through this speech in time. As much as I could under the circumstances in a region where hunter demand exceeded the supply of game, I applied the principles extolled by Tony Bubenik. Bill Workington, who's here today, and I, along with the help of several others, developed a series of antler and horn configurations for bighorn sheep, elk, mule deer, and white-tailed deer that persist in the hunting regulations to this day. In fact, Bill had a big hand in reorganizing. You think they're difficult now, you should have seen them before Bill reorganized them. So he got the credit for that. And they're still, I don't know how many years later, at least 30 years later, still same ones. The results were an immediate improvement on female-male ratios in bighorn sheep, elk, and mule deer. After some original trepidation and a little criticism, resident hunters and guides began to support the changes, and earlier reports of rutted-out starving bull elk in the midwinter ceased. And Anna Fontana's monitoring a reproductive performance in elk showing normal synchrony in conception. In other words, they were all being bred at about the same time, with further proof of the success of the program. Another tool of game management is predator control. Predator management falls into this category of benefiting wildlife, but people also need to hear, but to hear it from the anti-hunters, it is next to promoting devil worship. Talk about getting exercised. You should read some of the letters and op-eds from these self-proclaimed wildlife experts in the press in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. I imagine you get some of it here too, but not like we get down there. I think that increasing the moat between predators and human habitation is a good thing. And I think the mother of the young boy at Cowichan Lake, whose life she saved 2 weeks ago from a deadly cougar attack, might agree. Or the livestock owner, Betsy Klein, whose daughter's horse was killed by wolves in its stall 3 weeks ago in Arizona, which created a torrent of responses, both pro and con, on Facebook. Also, there are only so many surplus animals in a given population available for harvest or death by natural causes, including predation. As long as there is hunting on the wild lands of the province, hunters will have to share that surplus with wild carnivores. To what extent, I will leave that to others, including some of you. I'm out of the game now, so it's up to you guys. I think if there is a theme here, it is that while it might be difficult to achieve the level of abundance of big game, mainly ungulates, that hunters desire, We should increase our focus on attention on habitat management and animal herd and population quality. So predator control, yes, but put the emphasis on the animals and the habitat. What are some of the ways that hunters and hunting could benefit wildlife and humans? Endangered species are a popular topic and occupy a lot of our time, money, and effort. Hunters do more for species at risk than any other interest group by providing most of the research and recovery money spent in the province through the Habitat Conservation Trust Fund. No other group with an interest in wildlife even comes close. Although I am a believer that most of the money from hunters should go towards management of game species, and that species at risk should have a separate funding source, perhaps we should consider advertising the fact that hunters benefit non-game species as a benefit. Another example, and one that will require special attention, and I go carefully into this ground, will be to reopen the grizzly bear season over much of the interior. Forget about the mainland coast. Bear hunting has given way to bear viewing on the coast, and it is not likely to return. Controversial topic, I agree, but hunters were performing a great job for both wildlife health and human health and safety in the selective harvesting of grizzly bears. There's a model, okay? For 50 years, between 1968 and 2018, grizzly bear hunting regulations ensured that females with young and their young were protected, and that the annual hunter take of bears under a system of limited entry hunting was comprised mostly of males. Because the seasons in the Kootenays were during the spring, because females were protected, most cubless breeding-age females were in the company of adult males during the hunting season. If it happened that their mate was shot and killed by a hunter, do you not think that it would have had a profound effect on that female, who would then pass her fear and wariness of all humans on to her offspring? As the late, long-time, great East Kootenay guide outfitter Albert Cooper once told me, if a bull elk knows that it's safe inside Kootenay National Park and stands there as I ride by, and that it's not safe when it's out of the park and runs away, think of what a more intelligent animal like a grizzly bear knows. Unfortunately, I fear it will take an epidemic of grizzly bear attacks and a lot more agency-killed bears before the public realizes the folly of protecting all grizzly bears, even those that interact negatively with people's interests, safety, and health. Now, that maybe make headlines in the Toronto Star tomorrow, I don't know. Another area that needs attention, but there's a lot of science behind it. That pseudoscience that you hear about, that we don't know of how many there are, and we don't know what effect they're having. That's not true. We spent more money inventorying grizzly bears when I was in Victoria. I got $6 million to inventory grizzly bears in the bear. No other species in the province had ever had an investment of $6 million to be inventoried. We had the top grizzly bear scientists in British Columbia write a paper, hidden. You never saw it, saying that we had done a great job. Not one grizzly bear management unit in the province had an overharvest of females. Not one. I don't know how many there were, like 35 or something. But that's an amazing record. But you never heard about it. And the politicians, well, they responded by closing the season. All right. Another area that needs attention is the relationship between wildlife management and farming and ranching. And I heard that again today. I think that when I look at the fenced fields in the East Kootenay, that we are not winning that contest. Colorado has a lot more elk than BC, but it has other things going for it, and one of those is support from farmers. I credit this to their decision to compensate for wildlife damage for the past half century at least. Benefit farmers? Yes. Take responsibility for wildlife depredations. Pay compensation. Promote paid private land hunting. Maybe these incentives will prevent more ranchers from fencing their hayfields and might even encourage some to take their fences down. It works in Colorado, and it should work here as well. Bear with me, guys. I'm getting to the end. So where are we now? I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that generally speaking, the big game resources of the East Kootenay, indeed most of the province, are the lowest they've been in living memory. There are no quick fixes to solve this. Simply killing more predators won't do it alone. In fact, an overreaction could well cause a backlash from the leave it to nature advocates and set things back for big game management interests. And while we can learn from the past, we need to develop policies that work for where we are now, and decisions must be based on science in order to minimize the influence of politics and personal biases. You'll hear more about these topics from other speakers at the symposium. Beginning in May last year, the provincial government of BC made a commitment to improve wildlife management and habitat conservation and collaborate with stakeholders to develop long and short-term strategies to manage BC's wildlife resources by embarking on an extensive program of public consultation. I won't go into it here, but I assume that some, if not most of you, are aware of this initiative. I know for sure that Bill Hanlon is, and I appreciate him bringing me up to date on it. And I encourage you to pay attention and, if possible, get involved. Meanwhile, I leave you with three main thoughts to consider. First, I urge you to find common ground with other organizations, and one top area of concern where there could be significant unanimity is in reducing habitat loss. Designate areas specifically for wildlife in some cases, and designate seriously paying farmers for wildlife damage. Finally, it is long past due that we put wildlife considerations ahead of the timber supply on the most important wildlife habitats, which are usually low-grade forest areas. This business about not affecting the timber supply just has gone too far. We talked about this way back in the 70s. It's still there. I do not consider it sacrilegious to reduce the AAC where wildlife values, including big game, exceed timber values. Second, and this is sad, there are no caribou in the southern Selkirks. When I arrived in 1964, there were 28 caribou. And the 28 caribou, not the same ones because they'd gone through a couple of generations, but there were still 28 caribou when I left there for my 5-year job in Victoria in 1992. But the last two were trapped and moved to a new location before the wolves got them too. So where we had caribou and no wolves, we now have wolves but no caribou. Where the need is proven using science, predator control has to be in the manager's toolkit. This is a highly controversial topic and one that the media loves to exploit. So care has to be taken in and where such practices are to be applied. Alienating the public with predator bashing will only end in a stalemate and a catatonic response from government. You know, politicians love it when groups are in conflict. They don't have to do anything then. The third time is it's going to take time to rebuild the ungulate populations. So, in the meantime, while the quantity is short, start promoting quality. Begin promoting the kind of management that leads to stability, health, and safety among people and animals, and you will win the hearts and minds of the majority of folks, and that is what you need in a democracy where everyone has a stake. It's a start. Thanks.